everyone, my name is Katie and I am a fantasy writer hoping to self-publish the first book in my fantasy series within the next year or two. I'm currently in the world building stage of my writing process and I'm still fleshing out the details of the world. In my last video, I talked a little bit about how I'm world building by using the themes and the overall messaging that I want to promote within my books to inform the world building that I'm doing. So while the first part of my brainstorming process has been to figure out those themes and messaging, I'm now trying to figure out the types of characters or the archetypes that I want to use within my story, as well as the general like symbols and motifs and that kind of thing that I want to be important or recurring elements in the story. And you might be familiar with the Carl Jung, the psychologist, and his ideas of archetypes as a psychology concept. Archetypes are sort of a representation or like image of mostly universal patterns of thought or images, meaning that as humans, our brains are likely to sort subjectively similar people that we encounter throughout our lives into these sort of familiar identities or roles in our minds. Which is to say that somebody who reminds us of like our mother, or somebody who makes us think of this is the kind of person that a mother should be, will evoke the mother archetype in our brains. So chances are you are familiar with character archetypes such as the trickster or the fool, the child, you know, the mother, like I already said. And there's no standard or like agreed upon final list of archetypes defined by anyone really. I mean, there are like lists that exist out there, but Jung did have like 12 main archetypes that he referred to. But what he was basing those off of are the patterns of thought, again, that recur throughout human history, like characters that show up repeatedly in human folklore and myths and legends. So again, while there's no totally agreed upon set list of archetypes, you can kind of boil them down to a certain number that suits whatever story you're trying to tell. And you will notice that certain archetypes and tropes and motifs are frequently repeated within genres, within, you know, the audience that the story is intended for. And thinking about tropes is actually one of the ways that I try to inform my world building, because I'm writing a fantasy series and I want to incorporate elements of mythology and like folklore and fairy tales, because I find those stories really entertaining and really just full of potential. So whenever you're working within a genre, it's important to be aware of the tropes that go along with the genre, because that will inform what your audience is expecting from your book or whatever story it is that you're telling. So of course, tropes are similar to archetypes in that within a story, they represent familiar patterns of plot or patterns of action from the character that help to inform the genre. And so, since I'm writing a fantasy story, I want to be aware of the tropes that go along with fantasy so that I know what readers are expecting and I know where I want to meet those expectations and where I want to subvert them. Because part of understanding tropes is understanding where you can subvert them or flip them on their head, or you know, you can eliminate some tropes entirely depending on the story that you're telling. Something that someone might say is a given for fantasy is magic as a trope within fantasy, but you can have a fantasy story that really doesn't feature any magic at all, as long as the story takes place in a world that differs from our own in some significant way, and it doesn't have to be magic. That can still be fantasy. One of the more classic tropes of fantasy would be like the princess who's trapped in a tower and the knight who has to be a hero and slay the dragon to save the princess. If I wanted to use that trope, I would decide whether or not I want to keep that classic setup or if I wanted to subvert it in some way. Maybe I do a gender swap thing where it's the knight who's trapped in the tower and the princess has to go slay the dragon. So clearly your setup can be informed by the sort of character archetypes that you want to use in your story, and then use that to fill in the roles of the plot layout, which is knight or hero, princess or victim, and monster or dragon or whatever it is. For example, in the classic film Shrek, a number of fairy tale tropes and motifs are both subverted and used in the film. It even has that setup of the princess who's stuck in the tower and the hero who has to go save her. It actually doesn't really differ from the formula at all, except for one tiny detail. Shrek is not the archetypal knight. And that's sort of the whole point of the movie and him being the hero. Of course, Fiona isn't exactly the archetypal pure princess either, but that's not really important to the setup of her being in the castle, so we're just gonna ignore that. So again, the whole point of the movie Shrek is that Shrek is not the archetypal knight, and yet he is the one to rescue the princess and escort her safely to Duloc, where Lord Farquaad awaits her. But importantly, Shrek is also the one who gives Fiona the courage to be herself and the hope that she can be herself in the world and people will accept her the way that he shows up, just exactly who he is, and he can be met with acceptance. So while Shrek is an ogre, which is sort of the archetypal monster or villain in a lot of stories, he fulfills the role of the hero because of his actions and his character. He's an anti-hero, but still a hero. So you might be wondering, if I'm at the beginning of my world building process, why am I thinking so much about characters right now and trying to create characters before I've even created a world? And the answer to that is two parts. First and foremost, I'm not actually creating specific characters right now. I'm not trying to create my main character, protagonist, and my antagonist. I'm not crafting specific individuals right now. What I'm working on is incorporating the common archetypal characters that you see in stories, like what I want to tell. I'm more so trying to define the kinds of identities and roles that will be culturally important to the people of my world. So I am trying to create culture out of nothing, but that will be where I'm able to then create characters from, if that makes sense. Because the second part of what I'm trying to say is that while it seems weird that I'm world building and working on characters, doesn't really seem related. Like I mentioned in my previous video where I was talking about themes, the themes of your story are informed by the setting, the plot, and the characters. And so in order for me to stay on theme, I'm trying to create the archetypal characters that will fit for the messaging, again, that I'm trying to promote in my story. I gotta find a new way to say that because that's just the phrase that I have stuck in my head. And if I'm getting tired of it, I know people listening are going to get tired of it too. Sorry, I'm going on tangents. So anyway, all that is to say that it's important for me to get a feeling of where the sort of moral extremes are going to lie within this story, what kinds of characters I want to include, and, you know, just laying the basic seeds for what I will, you know, later reference to create my characters. One of my favorite resources for this has actually been tvtropes.org, which, while it's obviously titled for TV, genres and stories can be told across mediums, so it doesn't really matter that it's for TV. But it's a really good resource I have found for seeing like all of the tropes that can be associated with different genres, and it can definitely be a rabbit hole. It's sort of like Wikipedia, but for writing tropes or story tropes, TV tropes, whatever, you get what I'm saying. So in addition to looking at like typical fantasy tropes, I'm also looking at fairy tale and folklore tropes, mythological and early like legend tropes, that kind of thing. So when it comes to character creation, obviously the more specific you can be, the better. Combining archetypes is obviously a great place to start for creating new and interesting characters, giving a new twist to a typical role. And it's important to think about how the new archetypes can play off of each other as different characters, because of course we're looking for that sweet balance of conflict and complement like across and between characters. Wikipedia has a category for mythological archetypes that has various articles about like different figures, different locations and objects that appear throughout mythology. Think about something like the Tree of Life, or the Tree of Good and Evil, the Tree of Knowledge, the World Axis tree, the Norse Yggdrasil. This sort of world tree motif appears across, I think it's worldwide, and it's even a recurring theme in modern day contemporary fantasy stories. Tolkien pretty famously references a lot of these mythological figures and motifs and reworked them in a way that, as we all know, sort of defines modern fantasy as a genre. But he also has an example of this world tree. He has a couple of them actually, because in like the early world building, like the Silmarillion story, at the beginning of his universe, there were two trees, a gold tree and a silver tree. I'm sorry, I really don't know this as well as I should. Those trees were initially what gave the world light, like before the sun and the moon existed, and then I think they were turned into the sun and the moon or something. So that's like in the ancient history, but in like the Lord of the Rings books, there's also the White Tree of Gondor, and that's sort of the modern day depiction of this world tree. Something even more contemporary shows up in the, what's it called? The Legend of Korra, Avatar, The Legend of Korra. So the sequel series to Avatar: The Last Airbender. God, sorry, I can't talk right now. Her story arc has a lot to do with these North and South Pole tree axes? Is it two trees or is there one tree? I can't remember, but basically what I'm saying is that Wikipedia has a great list of motifs that appear throughout human history, and it's important to know these things because they're being used even today in modern storytelling. So that's all I was trying to say. The list is also important because it also references archetypes for deities that have appeared across human cultures too. And that's obviously going to be very important for when I'm crafting my world's cultures. We're not quite at the metaphysical world building stage, but we're getting there, and like some decisions are being made based on what I already have in terms of the themes that I'm working with, and then these like character archetypes that I'm trying to create. Obviously, the religious beliefs of people and groups and cultures is important because that informs the identities that they value, the roles that they value, and that informs the kinds of archetypes that get held up by these cultures. So that's how it all sort of works together. And there are a lot of things that you can refer to in order to inform the kinds of archetypes that you might want to create for your stories. There's a list of like 12 Jungian archetypes based on psychology, loosely. You could also create archetypes based off of the zodiac signs. You could use the Enneagram number personality system and create archetypes based off of those. You could use the Myers-Briggs personality tests. I think there's 16 of those. You could use D&D character subclasses and create a little party group that's well balanced. Each person has a role. You've got a cleric, your healer, you've got the barbarian, your muscle. You can really use just about any system that delineates people into different groups based on whatever arbitrary attributes you want to give them. You can combine different systems of categorizing people and create your own unique individual archetypes. So yeah, that's what I've been working on lately for my writing. However, I had a deadline set for myself this past Friday, and I was supposed to be done with figuring out these archetypes and symbols by then. However, that didn't happen. I had a very slow start to last week and didn't really get my groove going. And then in the second half of the week, one of the other roles that I have in life is as a substitute preschool teacher. And so I had to go in a couple of days during the second half of the week. It had been a little while since I had been at the preschool and I forgot how like physically exhausting it is. So I was just like knocked out for the rest of the week. So I haven't really, I'm really not where I want to be with my archetypes. But I should have a good amount of time this next week coming up. It's okay that we didn't meet a deadline, you know, these are self-imposed, so it's okay that I have to push things out a little bit, but I really didn't want to push out putting up another video. So I wanted to at least sit down and talk about what I'm doing and how I'm tackling it. And then in the next video, I can update you guys on whether or where I'm at in the process, and also hopefully moving into the next step of the world building, which will be my like metaphysical rules for the world. But ultimately, I think that a lot of the specifics of the archetypes and symbols that I'm using, I probably won't talk about too much, just because I feel like this is some of the fun, juicy world building that can be more fun to enjoy when you discover it while reading. I guess that's all that I really have to say today. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. Again, my name is Katie and I make videos about my writing process and how I plan to approach self-publishing fantasy books hopefully within the next year or so. I'm just trying to document the process of how I start from an idea and the world building and get to a finished product. So if that's interesting to you, I would love it if you subscribed. Thanks again so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!